Here. For those of you that do not know me, my name is Michael King, and I am the Executive Director of the Southwest Seattle Historical Society. I'm thrilled that you've joined us tonight for this month's Words, Writers, and Southwest Stories presentation. Before we begin, though, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that the Southwest Seattle Historical Society and our Log House Museum are located on the traditional land of the Duwamish people, past and present. This evening's session is made possible by our partnerships with the Seattle Public Library, as well as by the generous support of our sponsors 4Culture and Luna Park Cafe. As many of you are aware, the Historical Society hosts a wide range of programs and experiences that explore the history of the Duwamish Peninsula, and we can't do that without the support of our sponsors, so we're profoundly grateful to them. We also can't do that without your support. So we are grateful that you've joined us this evening. And if you're interested in making a donation to support our programming, I will post a link to our donation page in the chat in just a few moments. Given the size of our audience this evening, we're going to be utilizing the Q&A function for our question and answer session this evening. If you have a question for our speaker, please type it into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. I'm going to field questions on your behalf and direct them to our presenter after he concludes his presentation this evening. So with all that said, it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's presenter, Fred Poyner IV. Fred is a historian and author with over 27 years of experience in researching and writing about the art and history of the Pacific Northwest. His first book, The First Sculptor of Seattle, was funded through 4Culture's Heritage Projects Grant Award in 2014 and has received both the Association of King County Historical Organizations Virginia Marie Fulkins Award for Outstanding Historical Publication and the Washington Museum Association's Award of Excellence. Fred is a regular contributor to the Filson Company, as well as historical articles and essays for other organizations and publications, including HistoryLink.org, the Washington State Historical Society, the National Nordic Museum, Museum of the Mountain Man, and the Society of American Archivists. He holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in Art History from Western Washington University and a Master of Arts degree in Museology and Art from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Fred currently lives in Issaquah with his family, and I had the great fortune of collaborating with Fred in a previous role, so it's my distinct pleasure to welcome Fred to the Historical Society tonight. Fred, we are so grateful to have you this evening, and I'm going to turn things over to you now.
That's great. Thank you, Michael. Thank you for that introduction and the opportunity to speak tonight to your audience. The program for tonight is about an aviator from the Pacific Northwest, an early aviator by the name of Herbert Munter. And Munter was actually a very young man when he first delved into the emerging profession of aviation at the turn of the last century. The scope of his focus was really on building from scratch a homemade aircraft and test flying it in 1912 from off Harbor Island, which is right there in your neck of the woods, off the Duwamish tide flats. I'd like to give some acknowledgement as far as the origins of my interest in that. I initially did the research for the subject for an essay that is on HistoryLink.org site, both about Munter, his biography, his life, and then also another essay on HistoryLink where he had was the first pilot to fly over Mount Rainier. And I'm going to get right into the presentation here with some visuals and some other information where I go ahead and I'll share that screen right now and we'll get started. Munter began his flying career at the age of 18. He originally had come from Nome, Alaska with his family, where his family had been homesteading in 1907. They came to Seattle and moved to West Seattle. Munter was just enamored with the concept of flight. And he really spent his entire life being an aviator, being a test pilot, working with William Boeing to get the start of the Boeing Company. But also, he was really someone who was focused on just kind of making his mark in terms of aviation. He loved aviation, and this really came about as a result of his having seen Charles Hamilton, who was already an aviator, making a name for himself with his Curtiss biplane. Hamilton was actually one of the first aviators. He was the first aviator to do a flight between New York and Philadelphia. He was really someone who was into the exhibition aspect of this. And this is pretty important because after the first test flight in 1910, aviation had this sort of carnival and exhibitors feel to it. It was really a novelty. And so you had these trailbreakers like Hamilton, who they would go around the country. They would fly these exhibition flights in these aircraft, and really it was about entertainment more than it was about transportation. And part of that was that this was the cutting edge of aviation, and passengers were still not an option. They were single person aircraft. Well, Munter was at this exhibition flight where Hamilton came in. He flew in down to the Meadows racetrack on March 11th, 1910. And this is today near present day Boeing Field. And it was kind of this carnival atmosphere of Hamilton showing up. And Hamilton himself was really a really kind of wild figure. He smoked, he drank, he flew his airplane. He was in over 60 crashes in his lifetime, including the very next day where he crashed his plane into a lake nearby the Meadows racetrack, from which he walked away from. But I'm just going to jump back and forth as I talk here, but he actually got this nickname as a result called the Crazy Man of the Air. Well, Munter was not disturbed by the fact that Hamilton crashed his aircraft. In fact, he had an opportunity to look at it and examine it, and immediately was captivated by the idea of building his own aircraft from scratch. Well, Munter was one of the early aviators in Seattle. It took him 2 years to build this aircraft out of bamboo and balsa wood and hand-sewn fabric. And he did this in the basement of his parents' home. And it was one of these projects where he could actually take it apart and crate it up, which allowed him to dismantle it easily, and reassemble it from the place where he was going to be testing it out, which in this case turned out to be the tide flats in 1912. Before we get into the history of that event, what I did want to just mention that, history is a funny thing, and I learned first about Alice McKee, who was another aviator in the Northwest, during a Disneyland trip of all things, about 2 years ago. My family and I were going down to the California Adventure, and I happened to be standing in line waiting for this IMAX ride, and they had this entire section of aviation history as you waited in line to get into the IMAX. And just in the course of reading this, I learned about McKee and the fact that she was one of the groundbreaking aviators of the Pacific Northwest. She set a couple dozen altitude records. She was the first woman to fly in California, Oregon, Idaho, Washington, and Canada, and did this in 1912 when she first joined the Bennett Aero Company in California, but then continued as an aviator through much of the teens. So, and she was really one of these contemporaries of Munter, even down to flying the same kind of pusher type aircraft. And here's a good picture of her here in 1913, sitting in almost the same, very similar, if not identical, design of the aircraft that Munter first built. These pusher aircraft had the propellers in back. They were single-seater aircraft, and they were just really designed to be lightweight, but also designed to be exhibition aircraft. So Munter was an apprentice machinist at the Bremerton Navy Yard. So even at an early age, he had a passion and a skill for being able to build things. And he took that and applied it to his passion for aviation. This picture you see here is from one of his early Harbor Island flights. This is from 1912, and it shows the aircraft there in the upper right corner in flight. And here in the lower left is a picture of Munter in that very first aircraft that he built. And let me tell you, that looks, I'm sure he thought it was safe, and he worked on it for 2 years, but I think you have to be a little bit of a daredevil to go up in something like that. But he did it, and he put it to the test. And flew it out, and even though that flight only lasted a few minutes, it was successful. He landed safely. 2 years later, Munter had built another aircraft. This time it had the ability to carry a passenger, and he took aloft his brother in the first passenger flight that he did in 1914. Same location. And I guess, the location was good because it was flat, it was, over the water, and so there were some advantages there. As I said previously, Matt, he'd able to take some observations from Hamilton's plane, but also from a Curtiss biplane that he had seen in an article on Aerial Magazine for his inspiration. This aircraft was typical of the time, was very lightweight, made of bamboo poles, sewn fabric. This particular aircraft had a Hall Scott water-cooled engine with just 60 horsepower and just the single seat for the pilot. Well, in his time, in his time since the 4 years since he first did his first flight, Munter continued his desire to keep flying. He built 3 different aircraft, including a seaplane. But he was also really into this showmanship aspect, which was kind of sweeping the country in terms of aviation. As I mentioned, it was about showing people this novelty of flight, being able to fly over cities. Being able to take people aloft. In 1915, he took his mother on an 8-minute flight over Harbor Island in Elliott Bay, and there's a picture of her, and it's sitting in the aircraft. And he did this kind of exhibition flying around the Pacific Northwest, especially at things like fairs, to get to have an audience. It was also interesting in that, you know, with all these new developments in aircraft and designs, there were lots of opportunities to kind of set their mark. The aviators like Munter that were flying. In 1914, he set a new Northwest altitude record in his biplane, flying 6,800 feet over Enterprise, Oregon, and then another altitude record over Seattle. It's interesting too that at the time, the media looked at these kinds of flights as more a novelty feature rather than a business or transportation feature, meaning it was really about the excitement of the crowds and how these were, you know, a new twist being offered at the fair as an event or even an opportunity. But, you know, that was changing too, as people like William Boeing were looking at this as the future, really the way of the future in terms of travel. And Munter was sort of in the right place at the right time when Boeing came along and was looking to develop, you know, aviation as a more commercial enterprise. You had Boeing's desire to start an aero club of the Northwest, of which he was the president. And Boeing also with Lieutenant George Conrad Westervelt of the Navy, who got together and designed the first Boeing Model 1 Bmw Seaplane, named the Bluebill. And there's actually a picture of it here. This picture is in the Mohai archive on the right. It shows that Bluebill seaplane. And Munter, as it turns out, was one of the first test pilots of this seaplane. And really, he was the first employee of the new Boeing Company, Pacific Aero Products, which later became the Boeing Aircraft Company. Kind of an exciting time. A lot of what Boeing, I think, was envisioning for this seaplane, especially with the military, was that with the war, World War I underway, you know, this was an opportunity to make this type of new seaplane available to the Navy for the war effort. And the war did not last. It was over in 1918. And it turns out that the Navy, they made two of these seaplanes, which were offered to the Navy, and the Navy wasn't interested in either of them. They ended up going to New Zealand to start a mail run service. And if you go to the Museum of Flight today, there's a replica of this Bmw seaplane that's suspended. You can see that the pontoons are wood. It's got a propeller. You know, the engine and propeller have now shifted to the front. We're not looking at pusher aircraft anymore, like Munter's first aircraft. And this is in 1916. This was just 4 years after Munter built his first aircraft. What's surprising is you can already see structural changes, and the designs are getting a little bit more complex. This relationship between Munter and Boeing was one that progressed. Munter ended up testing the other seaplane, the Mallard, as well as a new Model C seaplane trainer. And the Model C was more successful. It ended up being that 51 of those were sold to the Navy, with the final delivery of those made in November of 1918. And so Munter was involved in that effort as well. Here's a picture of one of the seaplane Model C trainers. Well, with the end of the war, Munter and Boeing kind of went their separate ways. In 1919, he founded his own company called Aerial Tours. And this was, I think, Munter wanting to get kind of back to his roots in terms of being an exhibition pilot but also he was looking at this in terms of a passenger service. He wanted to offer these, he wanted to fly and offer excursions. He wanted to take people aloft and take them around and on tours. So not only did he do this with a new aircraft, but he also did it with a new airfield that was 14 miles south of Kent today, Kent, Washington. And this was called Munter Airfield. This is where he based this budding enterprise of his for doing aerial tours. And it even developed a reputation for visiting aviators. In 1920, Cliff Durant from Oakland flew up to Seattle to take part in the speedway races. And the only field where he could land was Munter's Field in Kent. But for this new aerial tours business, Munter needed he needed a new aircraft. So working through Boeing, the aircraft company, the L6 Biplane was something that was designed, and this was a cutting-edge, state-of-the-art aircraft, one of its kind. It had a 200 horsepower engine, and it had a 3-seat open cockpit. This is important because not only did it allow Munter to take one person aloft, it allowed him to take 2 passengers that could ride side by side. And this actually becomes very important later in some of Munter's achievements, like the flight over Rainier, where you see some of the first aerial photography of Mount Rainier come into being with that flight. So the Model 6 was first developed in 1919. And as far as my research could determine, it was the first commercial aircraft entirely designed and produced by the company. It had an all-wood construction. It had a similar wing design. It was a big aircraft. It had a wingspan of 44 feet, and it had a range of 450 miles. And again, for somebody like Munter, who's looking to make a name for himself with aerial tours or cross-country trips, that was important. He needed an aircraft that could go places from Seattle to Yakima or Seattle to Portland. That was the kind of vision that he was looking to offer for his passengers and his service. And I can just imagine, it must have been such an exciting time here in the Northwest to be an aviator, where you had all these new developments. You had Boeing building his company they really set the standard for aviation nationwide. And Munter was one of the pilots that was right in the middle, making a name for himself, but also contributing to that legacy. And, I'm not going to say we take it for granted, but aviation here is now kind of synonymous in the Northwest. It has been for a while, but it's really thanks to visionaries and pilots and engineers who put in the time and helped build Boeing and the different aspects of aviation that we find here today. Well, Munter operated this L6 biplane from his airfield, and he flew it to Eastern Washington, to Idaho. In 1920, he took his brother and Fred Strang, who represented the Seattle Chamber of Commerce, on a flight. Now, it's interesting because this tells me that Munter had some real savvy too. Here he is taking one of Seattle's business elite aloft and kind of getting them hooked on the idea of how important aviation could be as a local investment, as a local pastime, as a draw for people. This journey, he took them back through Walla Walla, through Southern Washington, and just giving them this grand tour of the state, all the way up down to Portland and then back up to Seattle. And this is there's a great diagram here in the slide that shows the BBL6, different characteristics of it. On July 25th, following this kind of cross-country flight he did with the Chamber of Commerce guy, Munter was kind of looking for his next big achievement to make following that. And he connected with one of the Seattle Times photographers, George Maxey, who went aloft with him. And on July 25th, they flew over Mount Rainier. This was really kind of a first of its kind feat. There's been some discussion back and forth that maybe Army flights had done this before 1920. But the important thing is that Munter was the first one to kind of get photographic proof of having done it and publicized it. And, this photograph here, Mount Rainier, appeared in the local newspapers. And so this really kind of helped cement his reputation as an aviator looking to make his mark. And there was certainly a business aspect of this too. I mean, who wouldn't want to go aloft, climb into an airplane and see Mount Rainier firsthand like that? I mean, it was surely something that was a draw and helped Munter with his business. Unfortunately, this in the long scheme of things, was kind of short-lived. Munter had a major fire on his field in 1923, which destroyed his one and only airplane. And it's unfortunate because following this fire, Munter kept a hand in aviation, but for about the next decade, he kind of branched off into other interests. He took up speedboat racing for a while. He got involved with doing some standing in as an airmail pilot between Seattle and BC. It's really not until 1934 when he gets back into this, and in a real serious way, when he started his own company again, the aircraft charter service. And again, in kind of this visionary aspect of aviation, he started this company as an air transport service to get goods and passengers up to Ketchikan, Alaska. There's no roads up there. If you want to get to Ketchikan, you got to go by water. And the opportunity to do it by air was not only time saving, but it was something that people were really excited about as an opportunity. As he developed this company, he spent the next 7 years developing this company, and it got popular to where he was flying in hunters to go up to Alaska, and really had this niche service going in terms of aviation. Well, another world war came along, and America's involvement in it in 1941 involved Munter as well. He sold his Alaska transport business. Initially, it was with the eye towards creating a larger airline, a more expanded version in the Pacific Northwest. I'm sorry about the dog. Anyway, the war was something that Munter got involved with. This time as an aviator himself, and also his son. They both enlisted in the U.S. Navy as qualified airmen. While Munter Sr. was sent up to Alaska, his son was sent to the Pacific Theater, and in the course of the war lost his life. But Herb Munter Sr., he did serve up at the Dutch Harbor Naval Operating Base, where he was there for 22 months and flew over 650 flight hours. And there's Dutch Harbor. For those of you not familiar with Dutch Harbor. This is another good, real kind of good shot of the base, the plan in 1942. This is included an air station where Munter would have flown out of. And these are some of the sample aircraft. These were patrol aircraft that were flying out of Dutch Harbor's station looking for Japanese ships and activity. Well, Munter survived the war, and at the end of the war, again started looking at airlines in the Northwest as something that he was both experienced with and also still passionate about. So he started up a new company with partner Nick Betts, who was a fisherman from Alaska. And in 1946, was granted his permit for the new airline, which was called West Coast Airlines. And Munter was an executive vice president of that. And kind of as an expanded company, this did air travel for passengers between 24 cities around Western Washington and Oregon. Munter remained at West Coast Airlines until his retirement from the company in 1958, which had by this time become rebranded as Air West. As I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, a lot of this research was done for historylink.org. It's a great site if you haven't checked it out or been familiar with it. HistoryLink talks about all kinds of different topics around Washington State. They just celebrated their 20-year anniversary, now 21 years. And there's a good, yours truly contributed a biography about Herb Munter, the aviator, and also the flight over Mount Rainier, which was so symbolic as an achievement. There's also a good essay about McKee Bryant and one of her altitude records that was set early on over the city of Seattle. And then there's some good information about the history of the Boeing Company there on the Boeing Company site. Before we wrap up the aviation part of the presentation and get into questions, I did want to just close with a couple quick final thoughts. My passion as a historian, art historian, and writer really is tied to sculpture and art of the Pacific Northwest, public art. My first book was about James Wen, a sculptor who lived in Seattle and really was one of the founding sculptors. For those who maybe have seen the Chief Seattle statue at the Seattle Center, that's one of Wen's pieces, maybe his best known piece, which he completed in 1912. As serendipitous as that would be, the year Munter did his first flight. Wen went on to do over 300 different plaques, statues, busts, memorials. I did a book about his life and his work in 2014 while I was working at the State Historical Society. The society holds the bulk of Wen's studio collection and maquettes, all his designs. But as any good historian will tell you, there's always more to learn, and that's certainly true too in the case of James Wen. I had an opportunity a couple of years back to do a talk about the book and about Wen, the book I wrote about him, and one of the audience members who originally is from Port Angeles was telling me about this medallion, which is found out at Crescent Beach. The Wen family had property out at Crescent Beach at one time, and it turns out that this medallion was done for Wen's neighbor who had the beach lot next door. And it's this memorial that memorializes not only Captain Cook and his visit, but also Chief Kitsap. If you look at the design here, you can see there's a ship that takes up most of the design, but there's also a portrait, smaller portrait medallion of Kitsap in profile. And that was something that Wen did as a separate medallion in bronze early on in his career. Wen did many different portraits of Chief Seattle and other local Northwest Indian figures, including several of the chiefs. So that was kind of a rewarding find for me. I have a new book that's coming out in March. It's again along the lines of Northwest sculpture history. The focus this time is on Portland's public sculpture, and it couldn't be more timely given what's been going on across the country. Portland is kind of right in the lens right now in a lot of respects, and the public art certainly is a part of that discussion. So the book is part of America Through Time, the series by Fonthill Media, and that'll be available through a couple places locally: Island Books on Mercer Island, or also the Barnes and Noble in Bellevue, or through the website. If anybody has questions or would like to follow up with me, here's my email. I also have a LinkedIn account for my social media. I do various posts about topics through the Filson journal, so I'm always welcome to hear people share things about local history or even make a new connection. So.
Thank you, Fred. We appreciate it. We have some questions for you. We have a few folks who've made some comments too. Carrie noted, interesting that the front prow nose of the seaplane is flat and square directly behind the propeller. We have a comment from Jean who said, my goodness, so much was going on during the 1918 pandemic. And James asked, were those biplanes? And I'm not sure if he was referring to a particular photograph. James, if you're referring to a particular photograph or reference that Fred made, you might mention that in the chat. Jean also mentioned that she lived in Alaska for 30 years and Dutch Harbor had sideways rain and very challenging. So probably quite challenging for aviators. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead. The question about the biplanes, certainly the plane Hamilton used when he first came here, I forgot to mention this, that was the very first flight in Seattle in 1910 when he made that visit. That was a Curtiss biplane that he ended up crashing as well. And certainly the biplane, even Munter's initial effort was a biplane design, and really something that he continued to experiment with, but more importantly that he came to rely on as well with certainly his own flying service later in the 20s.
Thanks, Fred. And James clarified his question about the biplanes. He was referring to the planes flying out of Dutch Harbor.
I believe those were not biplanes. Those were Navy PBY seaplanes. And I know they're not biplanes because my grandfather served on one during World War II. He was chief radioman on one of the PBYs out of Midway during the Midway battle. So a lot of good history. The PBYs, I think, are kind of one of the unsung heroes of the Navy aviation from World War II in the Pacific theater, just given the scope and important role they played, not only out of Dutch Harbor, but also out of Midway and other stations.
We have several other questions that have come through. Pat is asking, where was the first, this is a three-part question, so maybe I'll ask one part at a time. Where was the first Boeing plant? Well, actually, the second part of the question is very much related to the first. Was it on Lake Union? On which street end?
I believe, yes, it was on Lake Union. and I don't know the exact location, but the Boeing site that I had the link to, I think has some information about the original plant, where it was. The original plant was designed for seaplanes, so its proximity right on Lake Union was a kind of a needed, necessary thing.
Marcy is asking, what was the fuel for these aircraft?
That's a really good question. And the fuel was, I believe, gasoline type. Aviation fuel was something that was developed kind of in concert with the development of different aircraft. But to my knowledge, it was PBY. Sorry, I was reading the chat. It was a type of gasoline that was used. But I should mention too that because of weight restrictions, these planes couldn't carry a whole lot of fuel. The important thing was they needed to be lightweight. They were built from lightweight materials, and that was at least in these initial designs, that was kind of a necessity. That weight was always a factor.
Pat is asking, did Munter's son lose his life in combat, or by accident, or by other misadventure?
I'll be honest, I don't know. I believe it was through combat, but what I know about his son was that it was in the Pacific Theater, and that he was the only son of the Munter family, so the family took that pretty hard. But I don't know the circumstances of his death.
Gene noted, it's interesting to parallel Will Rogers' flight around 1935 to Barrow, Alaska, with what was going on in Washington around the same time.
Yeah, I think you had Charles Lindbergh and Munter, and this, it kind of gets back to this exhibition quality where pilots were trying to make a name for themselves. Certainly Amelia Earhart's another one, and it was about setting records, who could go the highest, who could go the farthest. In the case of the Hamilton trip from New York to Philadelphia, that one was a cash prize, $10,000, sponsored by the New York Times. So, there were bragging rights. There were certainly sometimes monetary stakes. But again, with this being a new mode of transport, there was a lot of risk too, and that was certainly the case for other aviators. It's interesting that Hamilton, for all his being a daredevil, didn't die in a crash. He died of tuberculosis in 1914. So that was kind of a tangent, but
we had a question from James again. He was wondering if you might be willing to show the slide of the PBYs.
Sure, I'll pull that back up. Let me do that. Whoops. Bear with me a second here. I'm just gonna get down to it. And I apologize for it's a little grainy. This is not the best quality image. Can you guys see that now?
Yeah, we can see that, Fred.
Yeah, this is a flight of PBYs. And this is not typical either of their operations. What the PBYs would do is they'd all go out in different directions, and they would have a search radius, kind of like the wedges on a pie, and that was their patrol radius where they were responsible for patrolling the range of their fuel and then coming back. And the thought being that each of them would have a wedge of this pie, and then all of them would therefore be able to do a certain search area, whether they were looking for ships or enemy activity, or even conducting early rescue missions for a downed pilot.
So James has a question about the PBYs. What are the things that look like small wings?
These right here. You know, I'm thinking those are, it is a type of lower wing, but those are where the pontoons are mounted. If you look, you can see pontoons underneath on either side, and these are to help provide when the ship or when the PBY lands, to provide support for the wings, and also during takeoff when they're landing on or taking off or landing on water. So this is kind of a structural thing. This is not a biplane design. This is, I misspoke earlier when I said that they didn't have two wings. They have this lower component which serves as a structural part, but it really is also to support these pontoons on either side to help with the ship's stability when they're both taking off and landing in water.
We have a comment from Ronald that says, I can remember flying a West Coast Airlines DC-3 as a child from Roseburg, Oregon to Seattle.
Interesting. I'm kind of, this is another tangent, but I'm a little fascinated by how much history there is between Seattle and Portland. And the reason I bring that up is that there's a great interview that just came out in Rolling Stone with Tina Mucklow. For those who don't know, Tina Mucklow was one of the stewardesses on the DB Cooper flight that was hijacked in the early 70s. Mucklow has really never before talked about in detail her experience with the hijacker. So if you get a chance, check out the Rolling Stone interview with her. She lives, I believe, in Eugene still today, but you know, she's kind of had a change of heart about the story and feels like, you know, history kind of owns it, which is one of the reasons why she's opening up about it now. But in the course of the DB Cooper history, I worked on an exhibition about that hijacking when I was at the Society in 2013. And one of the things that we looked at was the flight paths and history and operations between Portland and Seattle with Northwest Airlines. So there is certainly a lot of service history there and a lot of good history to read about. But check out the Rolling Stone interview if you haven't. It's really good.
Thanks, Fred. I have a question for you, Fred. Given everything you know about Munter and his designs for aircraft, if he invited you for a ride in one of his aircraft, do you think you'd join him, given what you know, or would you decline that invitation?
You know what? I'm to an age, I think I'd take him up on it. I think that would be on my bucket list. Yeah, I would do it. Yeah.
Wonderful.
And you know, he really was very thorough in his design and his fabrication. He was specific that way. In his very first aircraft, he double checked all his components, his measurements, the materials, and had the confidence, along with the vision and the skill, to make an aircraft that he was positive would work. So so my hat's off to him for doing that. And just one of a long line of those who have made aviation such an important part of our regional history.
Are there any other questions? If there's any other questions out there, this is a good time to type them either into the Q&A or into the chat. We'll give you another maybe 20 seconds to collect your thoughts. If you have any final questions for Fred, we are so grateful for you, Fred, for sharing your knowledge of this little known part of our service area's history. So we are, again, I'm very grateful to you, and we're so grateful here at the Historical Society for your support, as well as for the support of everyone that's joined us this evening.
Well, I'm really glad I had an opportunity to help the Southwest Seattle Historical Society with this talk. And it's always great when you can find a connection to your area. There's so much history with the Duwamish Waterway and Harbor Island, and really it's when I got to thinking about Munter and the connection there, I'm glad I had an opportunity to share it with some of your audience. So thank you, Michael. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. Fred, we had one final question come in. If you don't mind, one
Please.
last question. This will be the last question for the evening. Pat is asking whether Munter was born in Seattle, and if so, what high school or college did he attend?
No, he wasn't born in Seattle. His family originally came, I believe, from the Midwest. They homesteaded for 5 years up at Nome, Alaska. So between 1902 to 1907, they were up in Nome, trying to make a go of it there. And then the family relocated down to Seattle in 1907.
Well, we have a few attendees commenting, thank you so much. And again, I want to reiterate our gratitude, Fred. We're so grateful for your talk and the knowledge you've shared with us. And I hope everyone enjoyed this evening's presentation. We look forward to seeing you again very soon. We have another digital program next Thursday evening, so check out our website for more information about that. Otherwise, I hope you all stay well, and we'll be looking forward to seeing you again sometime very soon. Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Looks like some folks are still exiting here.
How was that, Mike?
Excellent. Yeah, that was a great presentation. We really appreciate it. It's such fascinating history, and I feel like it's a story or a moment in our history that it seems like it's been overshadowed by other names in the field of aviation to a certain extent.
Yeah, you hear a lot. You hear a lot about William Boeing. You hear a lot about even his partner, Westervelt, and that's fine. I mean, there's a lot of good history there, and certainly with the Boeing archives and Boeing, but with Bryant, like Keys Bryant, I was kind of floored when I came across her as someone who, there's an example of women's history that I never heard of her, and it was she's got a fascinating story. The husband, it turns out the husband she married was also a pilot. His name was Bryant, but he died like 2 years after they married, unfortunately. But it was kind of, like I say, it was a really risky business, and not for the faint of heart, those early aircraft.
Absolutely, yeah, it certainly seems like it. And did you say at the beginning of the presentation, Munter crashed 60 times alone?
That was Hamilton.
Hamilton, sorry, that's right.
Crashed over 60 times. Munter did some crashes too, including one of the early seaplanes, but he never died or was really seriously injured. But yeah, crashes were kind of part of the business then. So go figure, right?
yeah, I guess so. Not for the faint of heart, that's for sure. Well, thank you again, Fred. I will, once we get the recording processed, I'll make sure to get you a copy of that. And please keep me posted on
I will, Mike.
your
Thanks.
future research. We'd love to have you back for another presentation.
Great. Thank you very much. Thanks. Take care, buddy.
You too.